What if I told you that Christians and Hebrew Israelites, my brothers, my genetic family members, have no understanding for why God sent the plagues to Egypt? And sometimes I'm going to use the Greek term or nomenclature Egypt. And sometimes I'll use the term that Moses used in his writings, Mitzrayim. But what if I told you that they do not have the slightest idea why God called Moses? What if I also told you that they also do not understand what Moses wrote, which is the source of all the debating that carries on today on social media? In a series of videos leading to the Passover, which is why I'm doing these videos, I hopefully will show you all the plagues, show you what the plagues mean, and then explain to you why the Passover happened. What was the important understanding of the Passover? What does it mean? And how is it talking about Yahushua? You know, Christians have an idea only because the apostles and in the gospels it talks about Yahushua as being the Passover lamb. But what did Moses intend for us to understand about that event? Essentially, I'm going to provide you details about the death, resurrection of Yahushua Hamashiach from Moses's perspective. You know, there's a lot of talk about the law of Moses, and you know, there's a lot of theories out there, and that's fine because I'm not positioning myself in a place to debate anyone on anything. I'm simply going to provide information, and that information will either agree with what is meant to be understood or it won't. But I have no time for the silly debates. And so I'm going to show you these things. And the first plague that I want to deal with is the plague of the water. Now, the plagues ultimately are against the Pharaoh and what the Egyptians believed about him. Now, I know you see that there is a black Pharaoh here, and there's a lot of misconception, basically, a lot of lies about how the Egyptians looked. And it's very simple. And archaeologists know this. They know that when the walls of the Akkadians and Babylonians and the Egyptians were discovered, they had imagery on those walls that had color. And every group of people, the Akkadians, Babylonians, Sumerians, the Egyptians, they depicted themselves and their gods on the walls. They depicted their gods by how they looked. And so the Egyptians were melanated people, and they believed that their gods were melanated as well. Now, that minus the different imagery involved in the gods that are on their wall, because some had cobra's head, some had a beetle's head in a man's body, but you definitely know that their body had melanin, dark pigmentation. And this is why the authorities in Egypt, who are over Egyptology, that's not the state of Egypt, not the president of Egypt, but the foreign invaders of Egypt are still in control of Egyptology. That's a fact. And they chose to wash the colors off the temple walls. So you don't know, that is, the generations that have come after me, should the Lord tarry, which I doubt, the generations that will come after me won't know that the Egyptians were black. That is at least the aim that they are trying to um, accomplish. And so the Egyptians were black. And I have a black pharaoh here. And if you are a Christian and you're mad about that, kick rocks, go somewhere else. But ultimately, the plagues are against Pharaoh and what the Egyptians believed about him. I want to begin with the statement that Stephen made. And he says, Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in words and in deeds. And I have stated here and there in the video here or two that Moses was technically Egyptian. And that'll get some Hebrew Israelites upset. And I don't really care. Yes, his genetic family is Hebrew by origin, but Moses was adopted by a Nubian pharaoh that you just saw in the last slide at the age of 2 years old and brought up under that Nubian royal family of Pharaoh. And this simply means that Moses thought like the Egyptians thought because he was educated in all the ways of the Egyptians. That's what Stephen is talking about here. And Moses, being a part of the royal house of Pharaoh, he received a highly advanced education in astronomy, astrology, the religious ideas related to the gods, how to build temples and temple structures, pyramids. He was instructed in all of these things. And this is one of the reasons Stephen mentions this part of Moses' life in his statements regarding the history of the house of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Stephen intended for us to look at that. And I should say, God, through Stephen, intended for us to look at what Stephen said about Moses' education, because it is the backbone of everything that he wrote. If you read Joshua 24:14, you will also see that all the sons of Israel who came out of the Exodus were worshiping the gods of the Egyptians. They were, in fact, Egyptian themselves. They thought like Egyptians. They did what the Egyptians did. They worshiped what the Egyptians worshiped, even in their captivity in Mitzrayim. They worshiped the same gods that the Egyptians worshiped. Therefore, they too were technically Egyptian. Why? Because they thought like the Egyptians thought. They believed what the Egyptians believed. They acted how the Egyptians acted. And that's a fact. Many may want to dispute that. And you can do as you wish, but it's undisputable. I'm going to show you. So the Egyptians or the sons of Israel, they too acted like Egyptians. No different from them taking on the beliefs of the Canaanites when they went into the land of Canaan. They did the same thing while in captivity in Egypt. When God approached Moses, he intended to use the things that Moses learned and understood from the Egyptian priests. His intentions, however, was not to be like the Egyptians or to talk about the gods of the Egyptians in the sense that that's something that you have to believe. But God intended to mock the Egyptian belief system, as you will see in the plagues. And he used their imagery to teach the sons of Israel about himself. That's very important. That's very important to understand, because that is seen in what God calls himself by his memorial name and by the use of the Canaanite epithet El, or Elohim, that is used for the pantheon of the Canaanite belief system. If you did not know, the name El and the assembly Elohim comes from the Canaanite Ugaritic Phoenician belief system. And so God was not trying to be El in the sense that he's the Canaanite God. He used the epithet or the title to teach the sons of Israel about himself. That is quite different. And so in this series of videos, we will only deal with the Egyptian belief system, because that's what Moses learned. That's not all that Moses learned in his 40 years being in Egypt, because he learned some other things when he ran away from the Pharaoh and spent 40 years with his father-in-law. So now, Joshua 24:14, I'm going to show you that the sons of Israel who came out of the Exodus were worshiping Egyptian gods. It says, so now you fear Yahuwah, and you serve him in guiltlessness and in truth, and you must depart from the gods that your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Mitzrayim, that's Egypt, and you serve Yahuwah. The sons of Israel did not know who the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was, which is why Moses asked God, when I come unto the children of Israel and shall say unto them, the God of your fathers have sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, what is his name? I think it pretty logical to understand that if they did not know the name of the God that Moses was bringing to them in stating that he was going to deliver them from the captivity of Egypt, then they did not know who God was. The sons of Israel were living like Egyptians. They adopted the ways of Egypt, and you will see that shortly in how they thought and what they did when they entered into the wilderness after crossing the Red Sea. But you need to get it in your mind that they did not know who the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was. It is a fallacy to believe so. That is not a part of the narrative, the historical narrative. They did not know because they were worshiping the gods of the Egyptians. Now, in Exodus 32:1, I want to show you something about Aaron and the sons of Israel. And in verse 1, it says, the people saw that Moses delayed to descend from the mountain, and the people assembled themselves upon Aaron, and they said to him, arise, make for us gods, plural, that will walk before us. For this Moses, the man that caused us to go up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And so, as you can see, after God had sent all the plagues upon Pharaoh and the land of Egypt, the sons of Israel reverted back to belief in Egyptian gods and Egyptian beliefs. But I want you to clearly understand what they asked, because they asked something very specific. They asked Aaron to make them gods, plural. And the statement is important to understand, because in it you understand what the Egyptians believed. Egyptologists and those who claim to understand the ancient Kemetic belief system will never understand it without Moses, because Moses was taught to think like an Egyptian. From the time that he was adopted from the daughter of Pharaoh to the time that he ran away from Egypt, and had his first encounter with the true God who created the heavens and the earth. The Israelites, and I must stress this again, also thought like Egyptians. And they're about to show you in the next verse of Exodus chapter 32. And so Moses, in mocking the Egyptians, has also preserved how the Egyptians thought and what the Egyptians believed. The Egyptians believed in one God. This fallacy that they believed in multiple gods, it is not my belief that that is true. They believed in one God. But if you do not understand what the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans chapter 1, you will come away with the distortion of your own ignorance. This is what Paul says about the Egyptians, and not only the Egyptians, about the Babylonians, and not only the Babylonians, about the Canaanites as well. The three major religions talked about in the scriptures, the writings of Moses and the prophets. Paul says this: for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, in a lie. They hold the truth in a lie, because that which may be known of God or about God is manifest in them. It's revealed in them, for God have showed it. What is the it? That is the truth. He showed them the truth. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, because that when they knew God, I already told you, God had already shown them the truth. And if God had already shown them the truth, the Egyptians believed that there was one God. They glorified him not as God, just like many people do about Jesus Christ today. I hear it all over TikTok. Neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened, professing themselves to be wise. And this is where that statement, Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. They became fools. And what did they do? And changed the glory, that is light, which is the truth, of the uncorruptible God into an image made like creation. He says, into an image made like to corruptible man, that's Pharaoh, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. And what he is telling you is the Egyptians believed in one God who was invisible. They could not physically see him. So they corrupted the truth concerning him by making him into an image like corruptible man. The Israelites did the same thing when they rejected God. That's why we had Saul and David sit in the place of our king, that is Yahuwah, the creator of heaven and earth. The Israelites, with some influence by Eli's sons, who were corrupt priests, but the Israelites rejected God from being their king, and they wanted kings that they could see, just like the Egyptians. Who was the Egyptians' king? Pharaoh. Who was Pharaoh? Pharaoh was believed to be a god, the physical manifestation of the invisible God. Keep that in your mind. Hold that, because we're going to talk about what God did. And just to bring up the fact, in Samuel, that is not the first time it is mentioned that they were going to reject God and ask for a king like the nations. If you read the curses, and if you read after Deuteronomy 28, you're going to see the same statement. God had already prophesied that they was going to do that when they got into the land of the Canaanites, the promised land that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the Egyptians believed that this one God, who was invisible, or who is invisible, cannot be can be seen, physically in his creation. That is corruptible man, birds, and all the animals that were created. This is why they believed that God was a bull, a male bull, who was the sun that floated from east to west, etc., etc. You see, this level of understanding you're not going to get from your pastors, because they do not possess and are not in possession of the truth. They're spewing out things that come from Western Christianity. And those who are truly born again will be able to comprehend what I am saying, because they have that unction in them that will agree with the statements that I make. And that unction will teach them, that is, point out to them the truth, because the teaching was written on their heart. And it will be the same word that comes from my mouth. And all I have to do is point out the things that I see in the scriptures, and that unction in you is going to tell you that that's true. And you may not see it all right now, but the spirit in you, will tell you and inform you of the truth. So I want you to consider this in Mark 8:22 through 25. This is a parabolic pantomime or an event that is like the opening of the eyes of the blind, both physically and mentally. And he, Jesus, cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man unto him and besought him to touch him, that is the blind man. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught. And he looked up, that is the blind man, and said, I see. So he was blind. And after Jesus did what he did, this blind man says, I see men as trees walking, meaning that he wasn't able to see clearly, but he definitely began to see. And so what does Yahushua do? After that, he put his hands again upon his eyes and made him look up, and he was restored and saw every man clearly. Those who are truly born again and hear my words, they may not be able to see it clearly, but they see it. And if they continue to listen to the teachings that I believe God called me to point out, they will see everything clearly. So the Egyptians distorted the true knowledge of who God is by making the image of him like creation, that is, corruptible man, Pharaoh, Osiris, Ra, those human figures that you see on the walls, birds, and all the animals. And what do you see in the Egyptian temple walls? And what have they written in their papyrus? They gave you their beliefs, what they believed. This is why the Israelites asked Aaron to make them gods, plural. And what did Aaron make? Let's take a look. And he took from their hand, that is the gold earrings, the gold nose rings, whatever gold they had, and he formed him, notice the singular, with an engraving tool, and he made him, notice the singular, a molten male bull. And they said, watch this, these are your gods, Israel, which caused you to go up from the land of Egypt, or Mitzrayim. Notice everything that he says in the singular, the plural, the singular pronoun, him. He is talking about the invisible God that he made. He made him a molten male bull. And they said, these are your gods. That is because they know that the true God of heaven and earth is one God. But they attempted to bring him into physical manifestation by making him a man, corruptible cattle, corruptible birds, etc., etc. What they tried to do, which God is mocking, is make God a part of creation. And that's a distortion of the truth. Look at what Aaron made, and then look at what they said about what Aaron made. Aaron made a golden male bull, one male bull, which is why Moses wrote using the third masculine singular plural him. They called that one God, and we know it is a God because they layered it with gold. They called that bull their gods, one being many. But what you need to understand is this: that one golden bull God was the physical manifestation of the one invisible God that they could not see. That is, they distorted who our God was by creating his image as a part of this creation. They corrupted the incorruptible God who can't be seen. So the Egyptians essentially said that the God that is one is now on earth as a male bull, or a man called Pharaoh, or a part of this creation. One God manifested in many, excuse me. And I mentioned this because the so-called church fathers have many people believing a lie, and they're listening to this 4th century person who came up with the term Trinity. And then they're confused about whether they have 3 gods or one God. And then the one God can't be the same as the other 2 gods. They just don't understand the truth. And I'll show you that as well. But God was mocking the Egyptians. Our God used Moses to mock the stupidity of Egyptian belief systems. And in mocking the wisdom of the Egyptians, God called himself Yahuwah for a reason. He didn't just give him this name because he thought it sounded great. And for all those who still haven't overcome special education, the meaning of the tetragrammaton is he will be. That is what the name Yahuwah means. God, our God, named himself Yahuwah because he intended to continue to mock the mystery religions that Israel kept romanticizing over. So he made himself like creation in a mockery of the religions of this wicked world. They believe God came as a cow, so God called his name El. They believe that God was like the wind. God called himself Ruach, which means wind. They believe that God was like the sun. God made himself light. God is like a house. That's why Yahushua said, if you tear down this temple, and he was talking about his body. See, you're not ready to think on a higher level because it will make too much sense. And the devil don't want you to put these things together in your mind because he has to keep you in a lie. God is like a man. He came in the flesh of Yahushua HaMashiach. God is like a sheep. That is what we all describe Yahushua HaMashiach. And the firstborn, and the truth, and water, and Israel. And Hebrew Israelites are not ready for that because they are so stuck on this false distortion of replacement theology. If anyone is doing replacement theology, it is both the Hebrew Israelites and Christians who don't even have the slightest inclination of who Israel is. Israel is God's firstborn son. And you think that God did all of this for you to continue to call the sons of Jacob Israel. No. The problem is you don't know how Israel became a corporate body of members to one man, Yahushua HaMashiach, being God's firstborn son, whose name is Israel. I have many things that I will eventually need to say, many things to make clear. But one thing I can tell you for sure is that both Hebrew Israelites and Christians are guilty of replacement theology. Because if you are grafted into the olive tree, that tree is Yahushua HaMashiach. You, if you are lucky, are the branches. That is the whole point of his parable about the vine. But see, you want to spew out your own theology. I rest my case there. Let me continue because I know I have a lot of people upset on specifically that statement. Aaron made the Apis bull, Apis bull, who in the Egyptian theology is the sun god Ra, who is the Pharaoh in the flesh. The bull, the sun, and Pharaoh is all physical manifestations of the invisible God. And that's why God is about to mock Pharaoh and the Egyptians by using these plagues. The Egyptians believed that the invisible God could be seen in the sun, in this male bull, and in Pharaoh. God, in his anger, decided to mock the stupidity of the Egyptians because they made him a part of his creation. And God said, as a response to that stupidity, I will be who I will be, not I am that I am, but I will be who I will be. And the same God calls his memorial name Yahuwah, which means he will be. And he will be like the Ruach, that is the wind, and like his word that travels on the breath, which is parabolically described as the Ruach or wind from his mouth. Look at the Hebrew word, people. Look at how Job uses that word. Look at how David uses parallelism to describe the Ruach as the word of God, the word from his mouth. What the Egyptians took literally, God used parabolically in mocking them by describing the work that he did and will continue to do and finish literally in the earth. So God, the invisible God, came in the flesh of his creation. That person is called Adam, the last Adam, described in 1 Corinthians 15:45. And he, God, who came in his creation, reconciled the earth by mocking the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Canaanites and the philosophers of the Greeks. It doesn't matter which religion. God came mocking them all. But they all started with Egypt. They believed that the invisible God was literally corruptible man, that is Pharaoh, and all elements of his creation. So God came mocking the Egyptians by literally coming in the flesh, dying and resurrecting himself on the third day, like the Egyptians believed the Pharaoh who became the sun god and Osiris, passing through the land of the dead to rise to life as the resurrected sun god in the eastern sky. They called that eastern sky the field of reeds. That is heaven. That is heaven. And so God is mocking the Egyptians by doing the things that he did and will do. God was mocking their gods. And that is why you see in the plagues and in all the things Moses and the prophets wrote, God is mocking. So let's deal with the first plague, who is Osiris, and happy that the Egyptians made the invisible God. That the Egyptians made the invisible God. In Exodus chapter 7, starting at verse 14, I want to read this part and then I want to explain what it means to have a heavy heart according to what the Egyptians understood and what Moses understood. And Yahuwah said to Moses, the heart of Pharaoh is heavy. He refused to let the people go. And so Moses wrote what Yahuwah told him about Pharaoh. And what Moses wants us to know is that Yahuwah has knowledge of what the Egyptians believed regarding Pharaoh and his 3-day trek through the underworld that is in the land of the dead during his time. Now, the 3-day trek is parabolic by nature. When Pharaoh died, he became Osiris Ra. That is the dead body of Osiris, who is one with Ra. That is, they all are one and the same. They all are one and the same. And it's about what the Egyptians believed. They believed that Ra, who is the sun, came from the east, and as he floated to the west, began to die because the sun goes down at the horizon. And when the sun went down at the horizon, they believed that the sun died and had to trek 12 hours through the land of the dead. That was like a wilderness where nothing grew, there was no vegetation, etc., etc. And that same Ra became Osiris because he had to be successful in the resurrection. And Osiris, according to the myth of Osiris, did. Osiris also is the judge over the living and the dead. That should sound familiar. Anyway, through the 12 hours of the night, which the Egyptians called them the 12 gates, the sun god Ra, who is Pharaoh, they all are one, had to pass through each hour of the night in order to rise again on the dawn of the day. And once light was visible, that was the sign of the sun god Ra's resurrection from the land of the dead, usually called the underworld, into his mother, that is the sky goddess. That sky is the waters above. And then you have the waters below. That should sound exactly like Genesis chapter 1. But I digress. And so the trek was actually 12 hours, but the parabolic imagery is 3 days. The statement, the heart of Pharaoh is heavy, is a specific belief in the Egyptian belief system. In Egyptian theology and in the Exodus narrative, Pharaoh's heavy heart symbolizes guilt, wickedness, and a failure to uphold ma'at, that is the truth, which was depicted as a feather. In the afterlife, a heavy heart that is weighed down by sin, which is why that is disobedience, which is why God says he refused to let the people go. That heart would outweigh the feather of truth on a balance. And if the heart was heavy, it resulted in the consumption by the destroyer, Amit. And this Amit was a hybrid kind of crocodile that ate the hearts of those whose heart was weighed down with sin. The Egyptians believed the heart was the center of intellect and emotion, which was weighed against this feather of Ma'at, that is truth, after death in the land of the dead. That's a key location. Pharaoh's heart became heavy because of his disobedience to God's command, let my people go. And so God is telling Moses something that can be understood in the Egyptian belief system. He says again to Moses, the heart of Pharaoh is heavy. Why? He refused to let the people go. Pharaoh's heart was weighed down with sin against God's word, that is the truth. And God found that it was heavy. And if God finds that his heart is heavy, what do you think God is going to do? Well, he's going to do what the Egyptians believe, which is why you have the plague, the first plague. Pharaoh's disobedience to letting God's people go is the reason why God initiated the first plague. So the plague is against Pharaoh and what the Egyptians believe. And I already told you some of that. God is mocking the Egyptians, but he is also making a specific statement. A statement in which these asinine pastors that are out here claiming to be called from God can't tell you. But I'm going to tell you because you need to get rid of the lies that you believe. It's the only way you're going to get rid of the sins that are in your heart and displayed by the works of your hands. So people talking about you're not going to be saved by works. Well, yeah, you're right. Stop sinning, because that's a work. You know, you Christians, you're hilarious. You're extremely funny, and I don't blame you. I blame these so-called church fathers to whom you got your doctrine. Because though God said that he would pass his word along to the Gentile nations because what my ancestors did, he never said for y'all to create your own theology. You see, the point of the miracle of the bread and the fishes while the Israelites were in the wilderness, and Yahushua looked up to heaven and thanked God and blessed the bread and the fish, and then handed it down to his disciples, and his disciples handed it down to the crowds, was to display a parabolic pantomime, which means something that God had already said through Moses to the Israelites. And the point is, God handed down the word, which is like bread, to his disciples, who he made apostles, that was supposed to hand down that same word to the crowds who were listening, to the assemblies, to the assemblies. And it's the same thing that God said to the Israelites to do for their sons: hand down the meaning of the Passover to the next generation. He's talking about handing down the truth from one generation to the next generation. And the apostles had already told us that after they died, the truth would be distorted. And y'all believe in the church fathers and everything that they say, as if you don't know anything about what the apostle Paul and Peter said about the truth being distorted after their death. And so you Christians are hilarious. You're hilarious. And you really get on my nerves. And I blame you, but don't blame you, because it's not your fault, but it is your fault. Because you just chose with your vulnerability to go into a church and believe everything that they say without checking the source. And that's not your fault, because you weren't taught how God responds to a genuine apology. But I digress. Where was I? So the heart of Pharaoh would be consumed if it was found heavy while he was being judged before Osiris. Ain't that a trip? It's Osiris that's going through the land of the dead to be judged before Osiris. But that's how the Egyptians believed. Anyway, if the heart of Pharaoh was found heavy, like it is in this case here that God mentioned, then his heart would be destroyed. The Egyptians understood that the Pharaoh could not be resurrected from the dead if his heart was destroyed. If that happened, the entirety of Egypt would have no way to attain the resurrection, because they had to, when everyone died, they had to they had to be one in the body of Osiris at their death. And if Osiris can't attain the resurrection, the Egyptians won't attain the resurrection. If Pharaoh can't attain the resurrection, the Egyptians won't attain the resurrection. This is why Pharaoh carries the two items that he carries. One is a shepherd's staff, because he's the good shepherd for the Egyptians, and they were supposed to follow him. They were his sheep. We have a king who is our good shepherd, and his name is Yahushua Hamashiach, who is the physical representation of the invisible God, God in the flesh. For the Egyptians, 9 parts of the body had to be rejoined in order for Pharaoh to attain the resurrection. Thus, if his heart was destroyed, all hope was lost. All hope was lost. For the Pharaoh to attain the resurrection, he had to be rejoined with his members. Did you hear me? He had to be rejoined with his members, the members of his body. Thus, God was telling Moses that Pharaoh would not attain the resurrection because his heart was heavy. That had to piss Pharaoh off. Had to piss Pharaoh off because he knows what that means. And Moses was supposed to go and tell Pharaoh this. Moses knew what God meant by making this point about Pharaoh's heart because Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. God did all of this to Pharaoh by bringing the 10 plagues on all of Egypt. Let's continue. And Yahuwah said to Moses, the heart of Pharaoh is heavy. He refused to let the people go. You go to Pharaoh in the morning. Look, he is going up to the water, and you will stand upon the bank of the Nile River to call to him, and the rod which was changed, to a serpent, you will take in your hand, and you will say to him, Yahuwah, God of the Hebrew, he has sent me to you to say, you let my people go, so they will serve me in the wilderness. And look, you did not attentively listen until now. Now says Yahuwah, in what? That he refused to let the people go, you will know that I am Yahuwah. Look, I am causing to smite with the rod that is in my hand upon the waters which is in the Nile River, and they are turned to blood. And the fish that is in the Nile River, she will die, and the Nile River will smell foul, and Mitzrayim will grieve to drink the waters from the Nile River. That's the plague. That's what God did, but God didn't only do it to the Nile River. God made the waters in the stone and wooden vessels blood, streams that were going through the land blood. If they diverted water from the Nile to parts of their fields to grow crops, it was turned to blood. All of it was blood. There was no drinking water, none at all, no fresh drinking water from the Nile. The Egyptians worship the river Nile. And what you need to understand about the Nile is that the Nile was considered the divine life force, equating its waters with the exudation of Osiris. That is, they parabolically saw the waters of the Nile, the life blood of Osiris. The parabolic imagery of the Egyptians was that when they drank from the Nile, they were drinking the blood of Osiris. And the soul of Osiris is in the blood. That's the life force. So they believed that the life of Osiris was in the Nile waters. And by drinking that water, you had the opportunity to attain the resurrection because Osiris had the power to resurrect himself. So Yahuwah gave them blood. He took the parabolic imagery and literally made all the water in Egypt blood. Yahuwah also allowed all the living fish that was sustained by the water to die in a mocking of the Egyptians, that nothing in those waters had the opportunity to have life. And that was to make that point. The point is, the soul of Osiris cannot give you life. Drinking from it will not cause you to attain the resurrection. Let me read this first part of a hymn from the pyramid text called Giving Cold Water. This is what it says. You have your water, you have your flood, the fluid which issued from the God, the exudation that issued from Osiris. That is the blood of Osiris. And Yahuwah knows what the Egyptians believe, so he is mocking them and concealing the truth at the same time. The truth is, only through the blood of Yahushua HaMashiach will you have life and attain the resurrection. Yahushua said this: verily, verily, I say unto you, except ye eat the flesh of the Son of the Man and drink his blood, ye have no life in you. That was a specific dig at the now plague, at Osiris, in whom the Egyptians believed, at Pharaoh, in whom they thought was the physical manifestation of the invisible God. Whosoever eat of my flesh and drink of my blood hath eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is meat indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He that eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood dwelleth in me, and I in him. And that is what the Egyptians believed, that when they drank the waters of the Nile, they were drinking the blood of Osiris, and the soul of Osiris dwelled in them, and that gave them the opportunity, they believe, to attain the resurrection. Now, Yahushua is not talking about literally eating his flesh and drinking his blood. That's where many who followed him in his discipleship turned away from him, because the law of Moses forbids drinking the blood of any animal. Can you say male bull? But that is the animals of those religions. He was saying, don't act like them. But they failed to see the parabolic imagery in which Moses was presenting, because the Israelites lost the truth, like the church has lost the truth. And that's why they see statements like this. They can only regurgitate statements that they see in the Bible, but they don't know the intricate details of what the apostles understood, because Yahushua HaMashiach, he went through all the scriptures and showed them about himself in the writings of Moses and the Psalms. Can you hear me? So Yahushua is not talking literally, he's speaking parabolically, and he's talking about the word of God, because he is the physical manifestation of the word of God. When the Pharaoh died and began his trek in the underworld, he was both Ra and Osiris. The waters of the Nile was also the means by which the Pharaoh cleansed himself before he could ascend the mountain, in order to ascend into the field of reeds, which was found in the eastern sky, in the east. So people don't pray to the east because they are doing some religious ritual. Well, it is somewhat of a ritual, but the point of it is they were praying into the direction where the field of reed, that is heaven, is located. That is at least what the Egyptians believed. Yahuwah caused the waters to stink, and he did that for a purpose. And you can't say that it was because the dead fish was in the waters stinking it up, because those dead fish were not in the stone and wood vessels that also had blood in it. Read the rest of Exodus 7, chapter 7. God made any sign of water throughout the land of Egypt, including the Nile, was made blood. And Yahuwah made that water stink. God caused the waters to stink because God emphatically, by this plague, told Pharaoh that he would never attain the resurrection, because the waters they deemed holy was not pure and fit to be cleansed with, because it was foul. But remember, the waters are the exudation of Osiris. It is his blood, which was supposed to parabolically wash and clean the dead so they can attain the resurrection. Folks, this is not rocket science. What does Paul write? Husband, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. Ephesians chapter 5, 25 through 27. And so Paul is speaking parabolically using his knowledge concerning Egyptian mythology. They got their revelation and understanding of this from Yahushua HaMashiach, because Yahushua HaMashiach passed it down to his apostles, and his apostles were supposed to pass it down to the assemblies, the members of Christ's body, to whom he was coming back to. But they had to be cleansed by his blood. Like the Egyptians who followed Pharaoh had to be cleansed by his blood, because Pharaoh was Osiris in the land of the dead, making his trek to the eastern sky. It's all about resurrection. And if you don't understand Egyptian imagery, if you don't understand what the Egyptians believed, you will not understand what God was mocking when he used Moses. And everybody wants to talk and disagree and debate and have bitter arguments about the law of Moses. Moses already knew that the laws wasn't good. Moses was not giving them the law because he was trying to create some heritage. He was giving them the law, Torah, which means teaching, because he was teaching them about Christ. And the law was the tutor. But Moses did not give them laws after the 10 commandments. Moses gave them laws before the 10 commandments. What did he say to his father-in-law? Moses told his father-in-law, when the people come to him in a dispute, he would reconcile that dispute and teach them the statutes of God and his laws. He was already giving them laws and statutes before the 10 commandments ever existed out of the mouth of God, literally. And this is not a dig at anybody. This is just putting the narrative in its place so you can understand the purpose of the laws and statutes and ordinances and judgments and commandments that Moses was supposed to teach the children of Israel. Because even the 10 commandments, God told Moses that he was to teach them the 10 commandments. And one of those that you call 10 commandments, which is really 10 words, is the law concerning the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a teaching. That's why it's called law. And I hate that word, that term, law, because it doesn't give you the full scope of what Moses was trying to say. Torah means teaching. It comes from the root verb yara, which means to point out. And that's exactly what you do when you teach any material that you are teaching. You are pointing out the specific details of that discussion or that lesson. And God gave Moses teachings, Torah, Toroth, so that he can teach the sons of Israel about Yahushua Hamashiach, like I just did with this discussion on the plague of water. And there are many other things, but I'm going to go through all of the plagues. And then I'm going to tell you about the Passover and how the Passover is talking about Yahushua Hamashiach. And I'm going to explain how God killed all the firstborn in the land and yet told all the house of Israel to go into their houses and put blood on their doorposts. Why? Because the firstborn, the only firstborn that was going to live was Israel, God's firstborn son, who at that time was all the descendants of Jacob. But did you notice that there was no females outside of that doorpost? And why would females have to worry about the plague of the firstborn if they technically could not be a firstborn male to a father? We'll talk about that when we get to that plague. That's all I have for you at this moment, and we'll have more coming up. Feel free to look at all the other videos that I have in my playlist, which you'll find at the top of the ending of this video. I pray that this blessed you and gave you some true insight into the things that Moses understood, and that I'm fortunate enough to understand, because I believe God called me to point these things out. Shalom, house of Israel, and shalom to the genuine Gentiles who join themselves to Israel, God's firstborn son, Yahushua Hamashiach, and become a part of the house of Israel. That is, the members who are the branches of the vine that makes up the entirety of Israel. Shalom.